Let's break down our must-start defenses for Week 11 of the 2024 fantasy football season and go over what defenses you guys can pick up off of the waiver wire to help you dominate Week 11. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 11's action. And on top of that, they are also giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em to help you guys get a win on Underdog right off of the bat, as well as up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you guys sign up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. All right, so very quickly, let's break down this week's schedule because it's a tough week for streaming defenses, but we do have 4 teams on bye here in Week 11, and it is important to note, while none of these are really teams that we're wanting to start from a defensive perspective, there's 2 teams here that are important because we want to stream defenses against the Panthers and the Giants, and both of those teams are on bye week here in Week 11. Then we also have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Arizona Cardinals on bye week and here in Week 11. So when we start to break down the week, we have the Eagles on a short week, the tough matchup against the Commanders. So we have talked a lot about the Eagles defense recently, and I like them a lot, but I don't prefer them on a short week, even at home, because they're going up against the Washington Commanders. And then we look to Sunday. We do have an opportunity for the Miami Dolphins as they will be going up against the Las Vegas Raiders, a team that we've really liked to stream against this year. And I think they're worth the risk, but I also want to say I don't trust this Dolphins defense. They've been awful. I know they've had a great pass defense, but they are one of the worst teams in terms of fantasy points scored so far on the season. So it's a great matchup here, but they're the defense 30 in fantasy football. I don't quite know that I want to start them. Looking ahead here, the Steelers in a tough matchup this week, hosting the Baltimore Ravens at home, and they're coming off of a performance where they scored just 4 fantasy points against the Washington Commanders, so that definitely makes things tough. Then we do have an opportunity for the San Francisco 49ers, who are going to be hosting the Seattle Seahawks at home, but quite frankly, I know the Niners still kind of rank pretty high in terms of defensive teams, but I don't trust them, and I haven't trusted them this entire season. They had just 2 fantasy points against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Week 10. And then, while it feels like we have a great opportunity for the Jets defense as the Colts are coming off an abysmal performance this past week and a bad performance in Week 9, I've said it all year as well. I don't trust this Jets defense. I mean, quite frankly, we have 3 good performances on the season. I know Week 9 was promising against the Texans, but they got shredded by the Cardinals in Week 10. So there's plenty of risk here, plenty of upside. I almost put the Jets in today's list, but I don't quite trust them. So it's a tough week overall. And to make things worse, the Broncos defense has really fallen off here after being one of the best defensive options in fantasy football for a majority of the season. 4 fantasy points against the Chiefs, -2 against the Ravens, 6 against the Panthers in the past 3 weeks. They get the Falcons this week. I don't know that I'm going to risk that. Then we got the Chiefs and Bills. The Bills coming off a dominant performance against the Colts. I'm not going to risk them against the Kansas City Chiefs. Then the Chargers, one of the best units in terms of fantasy scoring on the season, coming off an okay performance with 8 fantasy points in Week 10 against the Titans that I expected a lot more out of. They get the Cincinnati Bengals. I'm not starting defensive teams against the Bengals. So let's take a look at who is left, but I will say it's a tough week in terms of streaming defenses. But let's break down 6 teams that I think are must-start defenses as we get into Week 11. And let's start, of course, with the Minnesota Vikings, who set at 88% rostered, but they continue to be our must-start defense overall. Told you guys, after that Week 8 performance, everyone freaking out. 1 point against the Rams. Don't lose faith in this unit. Short week, it happens. They have been dominant this season. I don't care what anyone says. 13 fantasy points in Week 10, 3 sacks, a forced fumble, 2 interceptions, just 143 total yards allowed against Mac Jones. And I get it, it was Mac Jones, but still, it's another great matchup this week against Will Levis and the Tennessee Titans, whether it's Will Levis or Mason Rudolph, I don't quite care. But Will Levis was not that bad against the Chargers, a good defensive unit, like we mentioned earlier. Don't get me wrong. He threw 2 touchdowns. He did have a fumble. It wasn't a lost fumble. So this was quite the improvement for Will Levis, who through the first 6 weeks of the season had an interception in every game and a lost fumble in 3 of those games. So let's give Will Levis his flowers, but come on, this is still a smash spot for the Minnesota Vikings, the #1 defense and fantasy scoring on the season thus far. You own the Vikings. Don't worry about anything. You start them every week, and they are a smash start, must start defense here in week 11. All right, next up, let's talk about the team that's playing the Jaguars this week, and that is the Detroit Lions. Now, I have to record these while Monday Night Football is being played, and the Lions haven't been that impressive against the Texans in week 10. But so far, going into week 10, they still average 10 fantasy points per game and were the defense 5 in fantasy scoring. So the Texans, good offense. So, I mean, I kind of like them going into week 10, I will admit, but it is what it is. Here in week 11, though, looks like Trevor Lawrence may end up missing the entire season, and even if T-Law somehow plays in week 11, I still think the Lions are a strong start. Home game for the Lions in week 11, going up against what's probably going to be a Mac Jones-led Jacksonville Jaguars offense that's also banged up across the board as well. We saw an injury to Tank Bigsby this past week. This receiver room is banged up, although Brian Thomas Jr. was able to play this past week, and Mac Jones threw 2 interceptions and had a lost fumble, only threw for 111 total passing yards in week 10. So I think the Lions are a true must-start defense this week as we approach week 11. I know Sunday Night Football not looking very promising, but regardless, going into this past week, they were the defense 5. Like I said, they've had 7 forced fumbles, 5 fumble recoveries, 11 picks, and a scoring touchdown so far on the season. And if I'm not mistaken, I think they lead the league in safeties as well. So overall, they are a strong start. They're playing Mac Jones this week, not the Texans and CJ Stroud. So if you're able to pick them up, I think they're a priority add on the waiver wire. If you own them, roll with them again in week 11 against the Jaguars. All right, next up is the Green Bay Packers, who have dropped to 21% rostered, and they get the Chicago Bears here in week 11. Now, the last time we saw the Packers, just 1 fantasy point against the Lions. Not too great, obviously. But they were still the defense 4 going into week 10 of the season. 7 forced fumbles, 8 fumble recoveries, 10 interceptions, a touchdown. And just don't forget how good that secondary has been for a majority of the season. And this week they're going to get the Bears, who, I mean, this offense was at a very good place against some soft defenses and has really come back to earth in the past 3 weeks or so. Caleb Williams, well, he has not really been turning the football over. No interceptions in the past 3 weeks. 1 lost fumble. But other than that, no turnovers in the past 3 weeks. This offense just has not been good in the past couple of weeks, to say the least. So, I mean, Caleb Williams only threw for 120 passing yards this past week. So, I like the Packers a lot. I mean, I don't know if they have a tremendous amount of upside, but I think they're going to go into this matchup with a really, really safe floor overall. So if they're out there and available, which they're coming off of their bye week, so very good chance that they are, I think they are a strong add going into week 11. The New England Patriots, the defense 25 going into week 10, had 16 fantasy points against the Bears in week 10. So I really like the Packers this week, and they are a team that we can pick up off of the waiver wire. I would consider them a must-start defense going into week 11. And next up, let's talk about the Houston Texans, who are going to travel to face the Cooper Rush-led Dallas Cowboys in week 11. And once again, I'm recording this while the Sunday Night Football game is being played, but the Texans looking pretty dang good. David Montgomery just scored a touchdown, which brings them down to 12 fantasy points on the night. We'll see how things wrap up. And ultimately, I haven't really trusted the Texans defense on the season. But if we don't include whatever happens in week 10, they have 3 double-digit performances on the season, 29 sacks, 5 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, 8 interceptions so far on the season. So, yeah, only 6.7 fantasy points per game. Nothing crazy here, but they come in at 29% rostered. And I know the Eagles defense is a different story, but they had 23 fantasy points on the road in Dallas against Cooper Rush and the Cowboys this past week. So I think the Texans are a viable streaming option that you guys can once again get off the waiver wire. So Cooper Rush, 2 fumbles, both of them lost, 45 passing yards, 2 rushing yards. If you're wondering, -2 fantasy points in week 10. Yeah, we got to start defenses against the Cowboys until further notice. And honestly, I was expecting some sort of life out of the Cowboys this past week, at least out of CeeDee Lamb or maybe Rico Dowdle, and it was a tough outing, and I'm expecting another tough outing against the Texans in week 11. Now, the Texans secondary has worried me on the season, so there is a little bit of risk associated here, but ultimately, I'm going to take that risk. They're a team we can pick up off the waiver wire. They have upside this week. If you want a little bit of upside in your starting lineup, let's roll with the Texans against the Cowboys here in week 11. All right, speaking of another team that's been tough for me to trust as of late, let's talk about the New Orleans Saints, who are going to face the Cleveland Browns at home in week 11. They sit at 25% rostered, and 9 fantasy points against Kirk Cousins and company at home in week 10. I would say is pretty dang good given the circumstances. 3 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, an interception. They did allow 468 passing yards, but if anything, I think that they go into week 11 again with a pretty solid floor. On the season, 19 sacks, 9 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, 11 interceptions. So going into week 10, they were the defense 13, and I think that they could come through with another solid floor type play as we approach the week. We look at the Browns in their last start, and they had an awful outing against the Chargers in week 9. 3 interceptions for Jameis Winston and a fumble. You go back and you look at that game, the Chargers were the top scoring defense in fantasy football in week 9 with 19 fantasy points. So I think there's still plenty of risk associated with the Saints. They've struggled against the run, but without Dennis Allen as a head coach, maybe there's some new life sparked into this team, coming off a win against the Falcons, all that stuff. We know that there's turnover upside with Jameis Winston as the starting quarterback. And once again, sitting at 25% rostered, they are a team we can go out to the waiver wire, pick up, and stream, and I think still have a good amount of upside. Probably at least interception upside here in week 11. All right, last but not least, let's talk about the LA Rams, who, once again, Monday Night Football has not been played. I don't quite know what we're going to get out against the Rams, against the Dolphins. I think they could end up having a not so great day, but they're on the road here against the New England Patriots. They come in at 15% rostered. They've averaged 8.3 fantasy points per game so far on the season, and outside of week 10 in their past 4 games, they've had 11 or more fantasy points in 3 out of those 4 games. So on the road here against Drake May, who, listen, Drake May's been fine, don't get me wrong, but he has had a turnover in each of the last 2 games, an interception this past week against the Bears, 2 interceptions and 2 fumbles against the Titans in week 9. His first rookie start will give him a pass, but still 2 interceptions and a fumble, then 2 clean games against the Jags and the Jets. So there's still turnover upside when Drake May is playing, and the Rams have been a pretty impressive unit, for the most part over the past month. We'll see what happens in Monday Night Football. Maybe that'll change our perspective. But they are the least roster team in today's video, and I always want to throw someone out or a team out there that we can at least take a flyer on that has some upside. And, I think especially if the Rams struggle against the Dolphins, verdict is still out there, obviously, then they may get dropped in even more leagues and are even easier to pick up. So there's nothing better out there. If you're in a deeper league, whatever it may be, the Rams are at least worth the risk here in week 11. That'll do it for today's video. There are your must-start defenses and streams as we move in to week 11 of the 2024 fantasy football season. If you guys need anything whatsoever as the week progresses, I will answer every single comment on today's video, so make sure to drop me a comment if you guys need anything moving into week 11 of the 2024 fantasy football season. But most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel, because we're going to have everything you could possibly need as the week progresses to help you dominate week 11 of the 2024 fantasy football season. So with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.